October 18, 1943, about 1100 Calvi Vecchia, Italy. The dust was still settling over the cobblestones of Calvi Vecchia. Elements of the British 169th London Infantry Brigade had pushed hard, fighting their way through the rugged Italian terrain to seize the village. By all tactical metrics, the operation was a resounding success. They had overrun the German positions and captured the objective well ahead of schedule. The streets were theirs. The enemy was retreating. But in the command post, the mood was not one of celebration, but of sudden, paralyzing terror. Victory had come too fast. According to the operational timetable, Calvi Vecchia was still supposed to be in enemy hands. High above, at the XII Air Support Command, flight crews were already strapped into their cockpits, engines turning over, preparing to unleash a devastating bombardment on this exact coordinate. The British infantry were standing on ground that was marked for obliteration by their own American allies. The British commander turned to his radio operator, desperate to send the abort code. The air raid had to be canceled immediately, but the radio remained silent, static, dead air. The rugged hills and the chaos of the advance had severed electronic communications. They were cut off. There was no time to run a line. There was no time to send a runner. The bombers were taxiing. In the sky, the drone of engines would soon replace the silence, and at least 100 British soldiers, men who had just survived a firefight, were minutes away from being wiped out by friendly fire. In this moment of high-tech failure, the modern army reverted to an ancient solution. The signal officer didn't reach for a microphone. He reached for a wicker basket. Inside sat a pigeon. His name was G.I. Joe. He was a blue-check splashcock, a member of the U.S. Army Pigeon Service attached to the British unit. He was not a piece of equipment that could be switched on or off. He was a living creature, bred for endurance and homing instinct. The message was scribbled hastily on a thin piece of paper, rolled tight, and inserted into the small capsule attached to the bird's leg. The handler stepped out into the ruin of the street. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and dust. He tossed G.I. Joe into the air. For a heartbeat, the bird circled, orienting himself against the magnetic pull of the earth, locking onto a home location 20 miles away. Then he banked and flew. The flight of G.I. Joe is a matter of record, a feat that defies the casual understanding of animal instinct. He did not meander. He drove himself forward with an intensity that matched the desperation of the men on the ground. He covered 20 miles in exactly 20 minutes, 60 miles per hour, a mile a minute. He arrived at the U.S. airfield just as the lead bombers were revving their engines for takeoff. The bird trapped, the message retrieved, the red flare fired. The mission was scrubbed. The engines cut out. 20 miles away, the British troops waited for the bombs that never fell. G.I. Joe had outpaced the technology that was supposed to replace him. For his actions that day, he would eventually become the only American pigeon to receive the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross or Medal of Honor, credited with saving over 100 lives. But G.I. Joe was not an anomaly. He was the tip of the spear of a massive, silent organization that operated in the shadows of the mechanized war. While the public newsreels focused on the roar of tanks and the thunder of artillery, the U.S. Army Pigeon Service, also known as the Signal Pigeon Corps, was conducting a global operation of staggering scale. This was not a hobbyist's pursuit. It was industrial warfare applied to biology. By the height of the conflict, the U.S. Army had mobilized 3,150 soldiers specifically to manage this winged infantry. They oversaw a flock of 54,000 pigeons. These birds were deployed to every theater of the war, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the steaming jungles of the South Pacific. The logic of the War Department was cold and pragmatic. Radios could be intercepted. They could be triangulated by enemy artillery. They were heavy, fragile, and dependent on batteries that often failed in the damp and cold. A pigeon was silent. It emitted no electronic signature. It required no power source other than grain and water, and most importantly, it was nearly undetectable. A single bird flying at treetop level at 60 miles per hour was a ghost to German radar, and a nearly impossible target for a rifleman. The statistics bore this out. Over the course of the war, despite flying through artillery barrages, small arms fire, and against natural predators like hawks, some of which were actually trained by the Germans to intercept Allied birds, over 90% of the messages sent by U.S. Army pigeons were successfully received. In the chaos of combat, that reliability rate was higher than almost any other form of communication available to the infantry commander. The infrastructure required to maintain this capability was immense. The heart of the operation lay in the United States, initially at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where the Signal Corps Pigeon Breeding and Training Section had been established after the lessons of the First World War. As the scope of the Second World War expanded, the center of gravity moved to Camp Crowder, Missouri, in October 1943. Here, the Army could breed up to 1,000 birds a month in an emergency, churning out recruits with the same regularity as the draft boards were churning out riflemen. The men who handled them, the pigeoneers, were a unique breed of soldier. They were part infantryman, part veterinarian, part trainer. They carried their charges in portable lofts on their backs or in specially modified trucks and trailers. They knew their birds by sight and temperament. They knew which birds were splashers that would fly through rain and which were night flyers. The bond between the pigeoneer and the bird was often the difference between life and death. A bird that didn't trust its handler might hesitate upon release, circling too long, making itself a target. A bird that wasn't properly conditioned might land in a tree to rest when the message it carried was a plea for artillery support. This biological reality dictated the doctrine. A pigeon that stopped to feed or roost was a mission failure, and in the calculus of 1943, a mission failure meant dead Americans. To mitigate this, the Army didn't just train the birds, they engineered the environment of war to accommodate them. The Signal Corps developed specialized equipment that would have seemed absurd in any other context. They created gas-proof bags to protect the birds during chemical attacks. They designed buoyancy devices for water landings. But perhaps the most audacious innovation was the method of delivery for the invasion of Fortress Europe. By August 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had issued a restricted manual on a technique that defied the natural order, releasing homing pigeons from aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour. It wasn't as simple as opening a window. The slipstream of a bomber would snap a bird's wings instantly. The engineers developed a specialized cage, wrapped in a paper bag or canister, attached to a parachute. Upon release, the canister would fall, the parachute would deploy, and a timed mechanism would release the bird at a safe altitude, allowing it to orient itself and fly to a mobile loft on the ground. The first pioneer of this airborne technique was a male bird named Thunderbird, but by June 1944, the practice had moved from experimental to essential. When the Allied Armada approached the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, the invasion force was operating under a suffocating blanket of radio silence. To break that silence was to invite the Luftwaffe or the Kriegsmarine. Electronic transmission was strictly forbidden until the beachheads were secured. Yet, commanders in England needed to know if the landings were succeeding or if the invasion was collapsing into the sea. The solution was a massive drop of thousands of pigeons, parachuted in special cages alongside the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, or carried ashore by the first waves of infantry. In the chaos of Omaha and Utah beaches, amidst the roar of the Atlantic Wall's defenses, these birds were the only link to the outside world. One such bird, an Irish pigeon named Paddy serving with the U.S. forces, was released from the hellscape of the French coast. He didn't panic. He didn't seek shelter from the flak. He locked onto his home loft in England and flew. Paddy covered the distance across the English Channel in 4 hours and 50 minutes, the first bird to return with news from the invasion force. He brought the first confirmation of operations back to high command while the radios were still static-heavy or silent. It was a feat of navigation that no machine of the era could replicate autonomously. But the utility of the pigeon service wasn't limited to the rapid movement of the airborne or the grand scale of D-Day. In the grinding, static warfare of the Italian campaign, the birds proved their worth in blood. The terrain of Italy, mountainous, rugged, and ancient, was a nightmare for radio waves. Signals were blocked by granite peaks or intercepted by German listening posts. Early in 1944, the battle for Monte Cassino had turned into a stalemate of World War I proportions. The fighting was hand-to-hand, house-to-house, and peak-to-peak. On a precarious position known as Hangman's Hill, a detachment of British and Gurkha troops found themselves cut off. They were surrounded by German paratroopers, pinned down by sniper fire and mortars. For 9 days they held out. Their batteries died. Their radios failed. They were isolated on a rock in the sky, invisible to their own artillery, which was preparing to shell the hill to suppress the German advance. The only way to establish contact was to physically carry the communication infrastructure up the mountain. In this case, the infrastructure was 3 American homing pigeons. Volunteers crawled through the German lines, inching their way up the slopes under cover of darkness, carrying the birds in baskets strapped to their chests. It was a suicide mission to deliver a bird. When they finally reached the beleaguered Gurkhas, the birds were prepped. They were released from the pocket, soaring over the heads of the German snipers who had the hills zeroed in. The pigeons returned to the Allied lines with messages detailing the exact position of the trapped men, and crucially, the coordinates for a safe withdrawal route. Because of those 3 birds, the unit was able to evacuate. They walked off Hangman's Hill alive. This reliability in the Mediterranean theater was not a fluke. Records indicate that on at least 20 separate occasions in that theater alone, pigeons were the only means of communication available. When the wires were cut and the radios were jammed, the birds got through. The scope of this effort required a supply chain that the military could not generate on its own. The U.S. Army Pigeon Service, despite its breeding centers at Fort Monmouth and later Camp Crowder, could not breed birds fast enough to replace combat losses and expand operations simultaneously. The Army turned to the American public. In a display of patriotism that is hard to imagine today, American pigeon fanciers, hobbyists from Brooklyn rooftops to Midwest farms, voluntarily donated approximately 40,000 of their own prize birds to the Signal Corps. These weren't just pets, they were athletes, bred for generations for speed and homing ability. The transition from civilian coop to military service was jarring. A bird raised in Ohio had to be retrained to home to a mobile loft in France that moved 5 miles every day. It required breaking the bird's natural imprint to a specific geographic location and replacing it with a loyalty to the mobile loft itself, or to the specific feeding rattle of the pigeoneer. However, the instinct to return to a true home was a force of nature that sometimes defied military discipline. In 1943, the Army procured a bird named Blackie from a civilian coop in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a prime specimen, the kind of flyer the Signal Corps desperately needed to fill the ranks. He was crated up and shipped 800 miles west to the new training center at Camp Crowder, Missouri. The Army's plan was to re-educate him, to strip away his loyalty to the Midwest, and forge a new allegiance to a military loft. But biology is stubborn. A few days after his arrival, during a routine exercise, Blackie escaped. He didn't circle the camp. He didn't look for a local roost. He turned east. Through a blinding snowstorm that grounded cargo planes and froze vehicle engines, this single bird flew 800 miles, navigating a landscape he had never seen from the air, solely to return to his original owner's backyard in Cleveland. When he arrived, exhausted and battered by the winter gale, the Army conceded defeat. The original owner was so impressed by the bird's sheer will that the military allowed him to keep Blackie. It was a stark reminder to the brass. You can draft a man and order him to march, but a pigeon's motivation is internal, primal, and absolute. To harness that power for combat, the pigeoneers had to be smarter than the instinct. The challenge in Europe wasn't just distance, it was mobility. The front line in 1944 was a fluid, violent thing. A fixed loft was useless if the infantry advanced 10 miles in a day. The solution was the mobile loft, converted trailers and trucks that served as the bird's home base. The training doctrine had to be rewritten. Birds were taught that home wasn't a specific GPS coordinate on a map, but the distinct shape and smell of a specific trailer, or the sound of a specific rattle used at feeding time. They were trained to spot their mobile loft even if it had moved 5, 10, or 15 miles since they were released. It was a psychological trick, convincing the animal that safety was a moving target. When this training held, the results were critical to the tactical picture. Consider the crossing of the Roer River in Germany, late in the war. The Wehrmacht had blown the dams, flooding the valley, turning the approach into a freezing, muddy kill zone. The current was too strong for boats. The shelling was too heavy for wire-laying teams. The advance of the Ninth Army hinged on precise coordination, yet the electronic spectrum was a mess of interference and German jamming. The solution was a deployment of 134 pigeons. In the heat of the crossing, these birds flew 25 critical messages across the turbulent water, but they carried more than just text. They carried 67 map overlays, transparent sheets marked with enemy fortifications, minefields, and machine gun nests. A radio operator could describe a coordinate, but he couldn't transmit a drawing. A pigeon could. Those overlays, flown through the smoke of the barrage, allowed the artillery to walk their fire ahead of the infantry, clearing a path that saved hundreds of American lives during the breakout into the Rhineland. This utility extended beyond the mud of Europe to the vast, blue expanse of the Pacific. Here, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the isolation. In the Southwest Pacific, small scout ships and PT boats often operated under strict radio silence to avoid detection by the Imperial Japanese Navy. A burst of radio static could bring down a Zero or a destroyer. The pigeon was the silent partner on the bridge. They were housed in small, salt spray-proof coops lashed to the deck. When a scout spotted an enemy convoy, the captain didn't reach for the radio handset. He wrote the coordinates, clamped the capsule, and released the bird. The pigeon would climb away from the rolling deck, orienting itself over a featureless ocean, and race back to the island base. It was the only way to coordinate an ambush without tipping off the target. By the time the Axis powers collapsed, the sheer volume of traffic carried by these animals was staggering. They had flown over the hedgerows of Normandy, the peaks of the Apennines, the jungles of Burma, and the deserts of North Africa. They had delivered the surrender demands to isolated German garrisons and carried the last letters of men who would not survive the day. As the dust settled and the occupation began, the military paused to recognize the cost and the contribution of this biological signal corps. The most decorated among them was the savior of Calvi Vecchia. On November 4, 1946, the atmosphere in London was solemn but celebratory. The war was over, the rebuilding had begun, and the British people were keen to honor those who had stood with them in the darkest hours. In a ceremony attended by high-ranking officers and the press, G.I. Joe was presented with the Dickin Medal. It is a heavy bronze medallion bearing the inscription for gallantry, and we also serve. It is the highest honor an animal can receive in military service, the Victoria Cross of the Animal Kingdom. Of the 54,000 birds managed by the American forces and the 250,000 used by the United Kingdom, only 32 pigeons received this medal during the war. G.I. Joe was the only American bird to stand in that elite company. The citation was read aloud, detailing his 20-minute flight that spared the lives of the 169th Brigade. For the men of that London infantry unit, the medal wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a receipt for their survival. But peace is often unkind to the tools of war. The post-war era brought a technological revolution that moved at a speed no bird could match. The transistor replaced the vacuum tube. Radios became smaller, lighter, and more reliable. Encryption became sophisticated enough to mask signals from the enemy. The age of the satellite and the computer was dawning. The logic that had sustained the pigeon program, that nature was more reliable than early electronics, began to crumble. The Army looked at the budget sheets and the capabilities of the new Signal Corps equipment and made a cold calculation. The cost of maintaining breeding centers, training pigeoneers, and hauling tons of grain was no longer justifiable. In 1957, the the order came down. The U.S. Army officially discontinued the use of pigeons as message carriers. The lofts at Fort Monmouth and Camp Crowder were dismantled or repurposed. The specialized trailers were sold as surplus. The pigeoneers, the men who had carried wicker baskets through the hell of Monte Cassino and the beaches of D-Day, were reassigned to new specialties or discharged. The era of the winged messenger, which had stretched from the trenches of the First World War to the nuclear age, was over. GI. Joe, however, lived to see the sunset of his service. After the war, he didn't return to a civilian coop or a stew pot. He was treated as a pensioner of the state, a living artifact of history. He was retired to the Detroit Zoological Gardens, where he lived in comfort, far from the roar of bombers and the crack of artillery. He became a symbol, a quiet attraction for veterans who would bring their grandchildren to the zoo, point through the wire, and try to explain how a bird had done what a radio could not. He died on June 3, 1961. He was 18 years old, a remarkable age for a pigeon, equivalent to a human living well past a century. His passing was noted not just in zoological logs but in military obituaries. With his death, the final living link to that desperate morning in Calvi Vecchia was severed. Today, the concept seems almost mythical. In an age of instant digital communication, where drone swarms and encrypted data links define the battlefield, the idea of entrusting the lives of a battalion to a bird with a capsule on its leg feels like ancient history. Yet, for the soldiers of the 169th Brigade, and for thousands of others across the globe, it was the only reality that mattered. When the batteries died, when the wires were cut, when the jamming was absolute, the soldier didn't look to the sky for a satellite. He looked to the basket, and more often than not, the bird was there, ready to fly into the fire, carrying the weight of the war on a pair of wings. To understand why a bird was treated with the reverence usually reserved for a field marshal, one must look past the medals and the museum exhibits to the specific, terrifying morning that defined the entire program. It was the moment that validated every grain of feed and every hour of training invested by the Signal Corps. The date was October 18, 1943. The location was a dusty, war-torn village in Italy called Calvi Vecchia. The tactical situation was a classic example of the chaos of war. The British 169th London Infantry Brigade had been tasked with seizing the village, a German stronghold that was blocking the Allied advance. The plan was a coordinated hammer and anvil strike. The infantry would push on the ground, and the U.S. XII Air Support Command would obliterate the German defenses from the air. The bombing run was scheduled, the coordinates were locked, and the heavy ordnance was loaded. But the men of the 169th fought with unexpected ferocity and speed. They broke the German line and occupied Calvi Vecchia ahead of schedule. By 1,000 hours, the British Tommies were clearing the streets, securing the perimeter, and digging in among the ruins. They had won the day, but in doing so, they had walked directly into the crosshairs of their own air support. The American bombers were on the tarmac 20 miles away, engines idling, crews running through their final checklists. They were preparing to level the very grid square the British now occupied. The British commander on the ground knew the schedule. He knew that in a matter of minutes the sky would turn black with Allied aircraft, and his men, at least 100 of them, likely many more, would be annihilated by friendly fire. He reached for the radio handset to call off the raid. All he got was static. The rugged Italian terrain, the interference of the atmosphere, or perhaps a mechanical failure had severed the electronic link. The radio operator tried every frequency. Nothing. The panic in the command post was palpable. They were shouting into a void while the clock ticked down. Runners were useless. The distance was too great to cover on foot or by jeep in the time remaining. The only option left was in a wicker basket. The bird chosen for this desperate sprint was G.I. Joe. He was a dark checker-patterned bird, unremarkable in appearance but possessed of a singular drive. At approximately 1100 hours, with the drone of the bomber engines likely already audible in the distance or the imagination of the troops, the British released him. This was not a training flight over the calm skies of New Jersey or the flatlands of Missouri. This was a sprint through the friction of war. G.I. Joe launched from the basket and did not hesitate. He did not circle to orient himself, a common delay for less experienced birds. He locked onto the magnetic pull of his home loft at the airfield and drove his wings into the air. The distance to the XII Air Support Command Base was exactly 20 miles. In the world of mechanized transport, a jeep on a cratered road might take an hour to cover that ground. A runner would never make it. Even a radio signal, bouncing off the limestone ridges of the Italian countryside, had failed to bridge the gap. It was up to the bird. G.I. Joe flew with a velocity that bordered on the impossible. He covered those 20 miles in 20 minutes flat. He was averaging 60 miles per hour, a sustained sprint that pushed the limits of his biology. Down below, the landscape was a blur of artillery smoke and moving columns, but the bird ignored the chaos. He was a singular point of focus, moving through the sky. At the airfield, the scene was one of controlled violence. The engines of the bombers were turning over, the props spinning into a blur, the noise deafening. The pilots were running their final instrument checks, their thumbs hovering over the ignition switches and throttle levers. The bombs were racked. The mission to level Calvi Vecchia was minutes, perhaps seconds, from becoming irreversible. G.I. Joe hit the landing board of the mobile loft at the edge of the tarmac. The pigeoneer on duty, alert to the flutter of wings even through the roar of the engines, scooped him up immediately. His hands moved with practiced speed, unshipping the capsule from the bird's leg and extracting the thin slip of paper. The message was clear. The British had the town. Cancel the strike. The word was sprinted to the control tower and flashed to the flight line. The order to stand down came just as the aircraft were taxiing for takeoff. The engines sputtered and died, the props winding down to a halt. In the silence that followed, the magnitude of the event settled over the base. 20 miles away, over 100 men of the 169th London Infantry Brigade were digging in, wiping sweat and grime from their faces, completely unaware that they had been minutes away from annihilation by their own allies. They were alive because a single bird, bred in America and flown in Italy, had beaten the speed of a bomber squadron. While G.I. Joe's flight was a miracle of speed, the invasion of Normandy 8 months later would demand a miracle of logistics. The challenge of D-Day was not just taking the beach, it was communicating from it. The planners knew that the initial hours of the invasion would be a blackout. Radios would be waterlogged in the surf, operators would be killed, and the enemy would be jamming every frequency they could find. To ensure a link back to command in England, the Allies prepared a massive airborne deployment of the Signal Pigeon Corps. This operation required a new kind of delivery system. You could not simply walk a bird onto a beach under machine gun fire and expect it to survive the landing craft. The solution was to drop them from the sky. The Army had been testing this concept with a pioneer bird named Thunderbird, the first male pigeon to successfully jump with a parachute. They developed a specialized cage, a wire mesh container wrapped in a shock-absorbing jacket, attached to a small, dedicated parachute. On the night of June 5th and the morning of June 6th, 1944, as the C-47s roared over the French coast, pigeoneers stood in the open doors alongside the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne. In the chaos of the drop, amidst the flak and the tracer fire, thousands of these cages were tossed into the slipstream. They drifted down into the hedgerows and the flooded fields of Normandy, silent comms packages waiting to be retrieved by the isolated pockets of invasion troops. For the men on the ground, finding a container was like finding a lifeline. When a unit was cut off, surrounded by German armor, and unable to raise command on the radio, they would crack the seal on the cage. Inside was a bird that knew only one thing: how to get back to England. One such bird was Paddy. He was an Irish pigeon, technically a civilian draftee, serving with the U.S. forces in the sector. On D-Day, the need for information was desperate. The commanders in England were staring at maps, blind to the chaos on the beaches, until Paddy arrived with the first news of the invasion's progress. He battled through storm clouds and enemy fire to cross the channel in record time, becoming the fastest pigeon to deliver a message on D-Day. His successful flight provided the critical confirmation that the Allies had finally breached the Atlantic Wall. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.